Welcome once again to Syntax Error, your pretentious, philosophical, pedantic podcast ostensibly about video gaming and related topics therein. Warning, this podcast contains spoilers, mature content, and language. Your discretion is advised. Hello there, and welcome back to Syntax Error. I, of course, as ever, remain Scott Thurlow, joined by Jonathan Ian Manzer.
Hello.
And Stephen Amosi.
How are you?
And continuing our coverage this season of sort of tentpole genres, like I'm calling them, tonight we'll be covering platformers with sort of a perhaps subgenre related to puzzlers, but not quite to that degree. But I'm going to start out with the history of games probably traces itself back to the greatest platformer ever, or the most well-known one, Super Mario Bros. 1 for the NES. Does anyone disagree?
That's a broad statement. I don't think the history of games traces itself
history
back
of platformers, I said.
No, you said games.
All right,
but
you're right.
The history of platformers probably starts before Super Mario Brothers.
Mm.
However, that's the one that everyone's going to recognize,
right?
Obviously, and I think that's the one that started off the love of platformers that we have.
I agree.
I will also say that Super Mario Brothers was the game that popularized video games.
Absolutely.
And thus, platformers were the genre that popularized.
We're sort of like associated with it by default.
Yeah.
For sure.
The new hotness.
Also,
in 1983.
If you go back to the Atari, one of the most famous games of all time was Pitfall.
You're right.
Which was a platformer.
Got to give props to Pitfall for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll do of course. Sure. So yeah. So we can talk about. I kind of want to do a brief history, but like not delve too much. Like SMB 1, 2, probably 3 was like the next like big iteration. Of course, the tie-in, the famous wizard thing, and all that. But I sort of want to delve into. Perhaps you just touched upon it. You just sort of brought up the point that I was going to explore.
I'm sorry. What was that? What's the famous wizard thing?
That SMB 3 drop. It was like basically the wizard was a.
Oh, the movie.
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Sorry, yeah, that's what I meant.
I got really confused for a second.
I hope people know what I meant by that, and clearly,
Okay.
I guess not everyone did. But the movie The Wizard features Super Mario Bros. 3 as sort of an advertisement, and Super Mario Bros. 3, yes, was fucking amazing. But yeah, I wanted to delve into, as you touched upon, like, perhaps it's because the first games in that era were platformers. It's two things, I guess, I want to bring up. A, the limitations of programming at the time. So that, like, basically there were sort of one of the only kinds of games that sort of could be made. Sure, you got your Tetrises, like you said, your Pitfalls, which is sort of that, and maybe like your little Atari sports games.
You had your shooters, your space shooters on Atari.
Your Space Invaders and all that, and all the asteroids and shit.
Yeah.
But sure.
So there were different types of games, but platformer was, I think, one that lent itself to people feeling more connected to the games.
Exactly.
Because they could put themselves in the shoes of, Indiana Jones, who is basically the guy from Pitfall, or even like Super Mario, you're running through,
at least
trying to save the princess or whatever. But
you have some sort of avatar, I guess, that you could be attached upon and go through the story. Like, think of it this way: perhaps there's almost like early like atmospheric storytelling in a sense. And like, sure, there's a story to it beyond that, like save the princess, etc. But all I'm getting at, I guess, beyond all that, is that this genre, yes, as you said, sort of codified because it happened to be, as I mentioned, like I would posit to you guys, an easy game to make given the limitations of the time, and that it happened to be attached to the console that sort of blew up gaming again at that time.
Blew it up.
Yeah, in general. But not like, so I'm not sort of delve into like, why is platform games so like sort of indelible? Like, its mark is still felt to this day. There are still platform games being made to this day, mostly by indie studios at this point.
Well, I mean, not if you're talking about 3D platformers.
Not always, right? Well, yeah, you're right. I'm sort of
not
getting
a lot, but there are those games too. Sorry.
You're right. No, but good point, because I sort of wanted to go to a somewhat of a progression, because you got your 2.5D, like that became a thing. Eventually, yeah, exactly, things like that. Ratchet and Clank, like things, and when 64 dropped, they had Super Mario Bros. 64, which is more or less full 3D.
Yeah, I mean, it was supposed to be one of the first, if not the first, full 3D platformer, right? Like, you could move about in three dimensions.
Your access allowed you to manipulate the camera and the world in order to navigate it as such.
So, I have an interesting thought here.
I like those.
Or it may not be interesting, I don't know.
We'll see.
But
give us the thought regardless.
So we're talking about Super Mario Brothers, and that it happened to be a platformer that was the what introduced people to video games really on a popular cultural level. Is its influence because there is something to do with platformers that that people are drawn to,
some inherent,
or is it just that people want to copy the success of Super Mario Brothers and its later iterations, and thus platformers have such a prestige simply because of happenstance?
Ian, great question.
That's exactly what I was going to say to him too. Go on, Steve.
I think that it's probably a little of both, to steal a phrase from Scott, perhaps. But it's, like I said, when you had those original games, the platformer was the first one that really made it personal, I think. And people are loath to move away from stuff like that.
We fear change.
Like, yeah.
Sure.
We've done a previous episode, I believe in Syntax Error, dealing with the fact that people will, if you're given shapes, you will
attach a story
to it. And so here's the thing is, on the spectrum of game types, I feel that platform games are almost as closest to like straight puzzle games as you can get, with still having an element. So you have like Tetris, which almost has no story whatsoever to it. And in a way...
we're building the Berlin Wall.
Except for that Russian music.
Yeah, as we decided. Anyway.
But, I mean, yeah, you can have like Dr. Mario, which is a similar like kind of
the same
game
shit.
thing, and there's a vague story to it, but there's a much greater story to Super Mario Brothers than to Dr. Mario.
Sure.
Now, so platformers have mechanics that require skill, and in a way, it's a puzzle-solving game. It's how do I maneuver and navigate the situation to progress in the storyline. And so I think that you might have hit on it with the fact that there is that platformers allow for a little bit more narrative than straight puzzle games do.
Right.
So it kind of appeals to both your narrative sense and to your game playing sense. And I think that it's one step over from puzzles, but that's what makes the difference there.
Well, that's and that's kind of the thing. Like when you're first, it's 1990 or whatever, or 1980, sorry, and you're trying to make a game, and you have visuals and 16-bit audio, or I'm sorry, 8-bit audio, if you're lucky. Nintendo is just coming out in Japan around that time. So, like, how do you tell a story with what you've got? And it's got to be all about the visuals. The music can help you, for sure. And
you had the little booklets that spelled out the story.
The booklets were amazing. Yeah. I wish they still did that, like, as in-depth as
before
they
you
used
go
to.
on, that could be an episode unto itself. But let's just, give props to the old school booklets, for sure.
Before things started getting into, like, before we got into, let's say, the Xbox original even the original PlayStation era, those booklets were some of the, like, they worked so goddamn hard on those things, and they were so awesome. I remember reading through every single one of them.
Dude, Zelda had a crazy booklet. Even Mario did too.
I got a game called Arrow the Acrobat, and I remember reading that booklet for, like, hours. Right. I got it on PlayStation or something.
All right, but, like I said, let's salute the booklets.
Also a platformer, so it ties in.
All right, fair enough.
But yeah, like that. Those were such a like big tie-in. Anyway, I'm sorry, we're getting far afield with booklets.
To further the point I just made, look at 3D games nowadays. So I'm going to take two, which are maybe an unfair comparison here because they're from very different generations. You take Resident Evil and you take Uncharted. Now they're both, in a sense, 3D. Like action
third-person
games.
action, more or less.
Yes, And in Resident Evil, they didn't have the ability to create kind of platforming elements to it because of the programming limitations and all that. Uncharted, though, does have that ability too. But in a way, they're both puzzle elements. In Resident Evil, you had like, find 5 of these arbitrary keys to get into the next
to get one
area.
master key to unlock. Yeah, sure, to progress. Yeah.
Where in Uncharted, it's doing the platforming elements of jumping which one's going, or like actually Mirror's Edge is a really good example of that, which is like, how can I make it to the next scene in a way, which is the platforming elements I need to move.
Yep.
So I think that, again, people really dislike the puzzle elements in those kind of action adventure games and like Resident Evil, and they do enjoy the platforming elements to it.
I see your point, and I just definitely agree. Going slightly back, I agree that there's probably a little bit of both. Like, that's why it works really well. So like, yeah, once like that core has been established, and like, I guess the point I was going to say is that they're very accessible, is the word I would use, right? Like, they're kind of easy to get into if done well. It's sort of like, without having a negative connotation to this word, it's simple mechanics, right? You press jump and shoot. Like, I was going to bring up Mega Man, the series as a whole, and 2 was probably my favorite and widely regarded as one of the best. But just as an example of these games don't have they have a very low entry barrier, right? But they can step up the challenge once you've been introduced to the elements. And therefore, other games that are maybe not necessarily in the genre itself can take elements from it and use them effectively because they're so easy to grasp, at least, again, at their basics, and they lend themselves to adding something to a game or a story, or both at some sense, at some time, because of the fact that they're, when used effectively, like it's almost like inherently enjoyable to play through them, to do them, at least for most people. Even if it's like some people are only like them, or you're not as big of a gamer, you can probably appreciate a platformer maybe more so than you would another type of game.
Yeah,
what do you think?
I would say it's I would say getting past the. You said it's inherently enjoyable. I would say getting past the inherent frustration of a platformer is enjoyable.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, that's like,
you try something 100 times and it fails, you just jump off a cliff or whatever. When you finally do it right, that feels great.
Sure, it's like the Dark Souls thing before Dark Souls even existed. I mean, that's always going to be true of sort of like something you're being taught, or like learning the skills and mechanics for. Once you start mastering them, you're like, yeah, I fucking owned it. Like, I know what I'm doing now.
But there is like, there is that, they platformers from the very beginning, and like even from, you think about Mario Brothers, whoever, I forget what his name is, but the guy that designed those levels is a master of like
was it not Miyamoto himself?
It might have been Miyamoto, but it was a master of making the end of a level be so fulfilling, so like fulfilling,
gratifying,
and like
for
makes
sure.
you feel so good when you get to that flag.
Yeah, you're like, fuck yeah, end. Flag.
Or
time,
even
man.
like even in Mario 3, when you get to that box that has the like, you get a little
Your
prize
reward.
at the end.
You
get a little prize at the end of every level. It's like feels so good,
So the rewarding factors is actually one of like, not only to all games, but especially the platformers, is something that you constantly need to be reaffirmed that you know what you're doing. And it has to feel rewarding. And that's where the skill difficulty comes in,
For sure.
the increase in it.
Yep, that's a good point.
So actually I was thinking more about the puzzle elements versus the platforming elements, where puzzle elements kind of do more logic-based generally. It's kind of a similar increase in difficulty.
Yeah.
Platformers are more reflexive-based.
Yeah.
And had that reflexive...
Twitch-based to a certain extent.
Oh,
in a sense. Yeah. You know what I mean?
But
reaction time stuff.
So I think that's what actually makes them more popular, too, is that they're... I don't think you... I think a lot more people have that ability to master the reflexive skills
versus
than
like
it is to solve complex logical issues.
Right. It's a matter of training rather than thinking. Mm-hmm. It requires a lot less cognitive ability, I guess, to master like a platform.
Well, to an extent, yeah.
Unless it's a puzzle platform.
Just less obviously.
Of it. Yeah. But like, it requires less cognitive ability and more just like going through and like getting that endorphin rush when you complete something at the end. Whereas puzzle games, I mean, you kind of get the same thing when you solve a puzzle, but if you never solve that puzzle, you're just like, this game left me wanting.
But like theoretically, both genres should have an increase in difficulty that makes sense to what techniques you learned before.
You used a good word. We were discussing this precast, and you said it should be a well-balanced gradient, which I think is the best, like one of the best descriptions that makes sense and like exemplifies what we're speaking about here for sure. But I want to like touch upon something a little bit that you made me think of just saying what you said. Yes, pure puzzle games require more like brain power, I guess, linguistic or logical brain power. But to be fair, like for example, when you're trying to learn a level, you have to remember like, oh, a jump's coming here, a dude's coming down there, which is basically
but that's
kind
training.
of a puzzle. Yeah,
like I say, that's training as opposed to trying to figure something new out. Right?
No,
as opposed to figuring something new out, it's
well,
like you get told what that new thing is or you get shown what the new thing is, and then you just have to train at it until you're good enough at it to complete it.
You're right, to keep your progression going and remember, like I said, I mean, I'm just saying like...
it's a different set of skills that are required cognitively. I'm not saying that like...
One is better than the other, sure.
Yeah, they're both useful skills.
Yeah.
And sometimes like you can even use them together in a sense. Like if, for example, like if a platform is moving but I have to like do a mousetrap kind of thing to get around it, like it's sort of like a good game will sort of combine those as almost like its own like little mini boss or boss battle even.
Absolutely.
To get through the next level or the stage or whatever, what have you.
I mean, you go look at a game like Braid.
Yep.
And I'm sure that's on all, it should be on.
That's a really good example.
It's a very good game, but like that is the purest form of like a platform puzzler. And it's almost both of those games at their purest level. Yeah. Like it is all puzzles and it is all platforming.
I like that. I like that a lot.
So like there are games like that like do that heavy crossover, but there's also games that Super Mario Brothers at its core is just a platformer. It's not a puzzle game. You don't really have to solve anything to get through it.
I mean, you solve the stages by learning how to, as you said, train yourself.
Exactly, by training to beat them. Sure. And then there's all kinds of, as you said, gradients in between that are, different like levels of that. I think platformers and puzzlers really make good crossovers. And like there's other crossovers with other like genres
to be had.
Them,
for
like,
sure.
Like horror or whatever, or like action or whatever. Like there's platform games that are like that, and there's other types of crossovers as well that platformers go with. But I think the best one, or at least the most natural one, the most natural feeling one, is puzzle games and platformers because they work really well together.
Now, there's 2 points I'd like to bring up now about negatives to platformers.
Okay.
And my first one is probably more to do with the limitations of like the NES. And that's where I'm drawing my experience from. But early platformers, like the Mega Mans, were designed to impede your progress. Not so much that in order to extend the life of the game.
Yeah, you're right. I see what you mean, for sure.
Because you couldn't save, right? And like things like that. You had these limitations, as you just said.
Yep.
And also, I mean, if you were perfect at running through like Mega Man 1, you'd beat the game in a short amount of time. So they wanted you to extend that for hours, and it's an artificial extension. So I think you don't see that much anymore.
Because we can move beyond the program limitations.
Yes.
But you're right, that certainly was an aspect. And you're right, it's sort of like, you don't see it as much because of that very thing.
Actually, a good example of that is the original Super Mario Brothers, or the Mario Brothers and Super Mario Brothers for the SNES, which was an easier game, if only for the fact that they had more to show you of the game.
And you could save as well on SNES. Super Mario World, I believe, what it was.
Yeah.
But also one of the greatest platformers ever. But you're right, that's an interesting point, that you sort of like, because as I use this term, the march of technology, that meant they didn't have to again, artificially extending the length of game has a negative sort of connotation generally to it.
As it should.
But but that's what they had to do. Mega Man 2 was hard as fuck because they had to ramp it up.
Was it Doki Doki Panic or something like that?
I remember. But I want to roll back a little bit to.
And also the covers were terrible.
Yes, thanks, Donnie.
But my second point is a similar one. Which the main actually flaw in a platformer is when the game developers do not use their mechanics well. And
or just like shoddy programming.
yes, because if
Subpar.
you have a platformer, especially nowadays with the influx of games, games that frustrate you for like when you think it's unfair that they're punishing you.
Yeah.
I remember you were playing Mirror's Edge Catalyst or whatever vague thing that it was called.
I think it was.
You felt that it's a platformer at heart, and that the mechanics weren't always working correctly when
I felt the responsiveness wasn't there.
Yes.
Maybe it's just me, raging out,
But
whatever.
I mean,
but
that does
but still,
happen in
nevertheless,
games.
you're right. Go on.
And I think that's the greatest flaw. When I should be able to make this jump, but for some reason my character doesn't, and I die, and now I'm reset back all the way. So I think that ties in with the NES argument, but I think that's still where the artificial extension doesn't exist much anymore. The shoddy programming does.
You could still fall into that trap. And I think you're absolutely right. That's a great point. And sort of like, it's not a cornerstone. Like, yeah. And we said this a number of times on Syntax about any number of games, whether platformers or not, that, yeah, when I feel as a player, the responsiveness isn't there, or like, oh, I've done this same kind of jump like 50 other times. Why the fuck didn't it work right now? What am I doing wrong? Is it me? Or is it like something up with the game? Or is it even at the outset, like, it's not as tight as it should be? That's going to ruin your experience for sure, and that's on them as a programmer to like to QA it and all that. But I want to bring up before I interrupt you, which sorry about that, but because Steve-O,
It's already after you've interrupted him.
well, retroactively sorry, but you brought up Braid. I think that's a really good example just in general because it sort of like was I'll say perhaps the opening cusp of the new wave of like retro style games using retro style graphics, but having a good story attached to it, even if it was like sort of half environmental, like quite a bit unclear as to what the fuck is happening. Nevertheless, though, it used, as you said, core puzzle mechanics and also core platform mechanics and puzzle mechanics sort of at once, using the best bits of both to combine them into a great experience.
Yeah, that's about as good as you're going to get as far as a puzzle platformer mix. You know, like, it's not that every single level is a puzzle and every single level is a platform.
You had to use both sets of skills to apply to it. Sure.
Exactly. And like there's a lot of other games that have done various degrees of that since then and before then.
Sure.
But yeah, that was kind of a high watermark in terms of combining those.
I guess I'll say it ushered in a new age of perhaps like retro-ish gaming and specifically platformers in general. But I wanted to bring up stuff like for example on our big board. You're going to see the big board. If you were here, you could see the big board. That I had puzzle/platformer as one subject and Metroidvania as a different one.
Right.
But really, like in theory and even in practice, Metroid and Castlevania is like they're at the core of it. They're platformers, really. At least the old ones, like the old school ones, the original ones.
My argument, though, is I think it would be actually fair to split up the two because of how influential that Metroidvania is.
It sort of created its own subgenre.
Metroidvania is a huge subgenre.
Using platformers as like its base, for sure. But I mean, as we said, I think there's some kind of like, I argue for that either because of the nature of it being like one of the first iterations of games that brought many people to this hobby to be interested in them, and also because it's somewhat easier to program. Like there's not that much complexity, I would imagine, in the code and all that. Like it's sort of like very inclusive and very, like I said, like a good gateway to get people into it. And clearly, like it worked to an extent. Like Mario Brothers is in the museum of like video games at this point. Like it's one of the first ones, of course, to enter into
should
it.
Be. Yeah. If there's a museum of video games, it should start with.
I'm just saying, like, no, well, I mean, Pac-Man is in it too. Like, we can talk about that later. But I'm just saying, like, yeah, it was such a like pedestal that so many things sprang from it. So like that's why it's still effective to this day, and they're still popular and being made, albeit, as I said, by indie developers. But nevertheless, people will still play them because of all these factors, and I think they're still very effective and can be.
Yeah. You want to say that?
I just want to say that not only like, when you're talking about AAA games too, you still see a lot of games implement platforming elements in it, even though if they're not strict platformers.
Yeah.
So.
No, you're right. You're absolutely right about that.
True.
That is absolutely true, and that's why you can sort of see like its influence, its imprint, its carbon game footprint, if you will, like still impacts other things that like around it, even if they're not like in the same sphere.
Yeah.
Per se.
I think there is, and I think we already talked about this a little bit. I came into this conversation with somewhat of a question, like kind of why are we so fascinated with platformers? I think we answered.
I think we sort of.
I think we
that.
talked about that a lot.
Quite well, and I mean, it's a good question for sure. I think we said why the factors are.
That fascination, as you were saying, Ian, like kind of bleeds over into a lot of other types of games as well, which is an interesting thing to see. What I wanted to ask you guys, I guess we're probably going to wind down pretty soon, but do you have any favorite modern platformers? I've got a list here of my own, but if you guys have anything,
I'll toss out a couple. Actually, I'll give you. I meant to toss out some other earlier ones, so I would be remiss if I did not mention Battletoads.
Oh, if we're going old school.
Yeah, well, I meant to mention it earlier, so I'm mentioning it now.
That's a good call.
But I will answer your question, your actual question. I would say Axiom Verge, which is sort of Metroidvania too, to be sure. Don't get me wrong, but at the core of it, and I would say maybe Inside, perhaps, or Little Nightmares might be up there more recently. Mm-hmm. So I'll toss those out. You guys, I'll open up to you.
Well, I'm going to throw out one that I like, not because of the mechanics and because it's a platformer, but that I thought it had a great storyline attached to it. Mm-hmm. Thomas Was Alone.
Yep.
I really enjoyed it. I think I recommended it to both of you when I played it.
You did indeed.
And I played it and it was great.
I am sorry I did not play it, but you did recommend it, and you said you liked it, yes.
Yeah. So that was a strict platformer. There's no Metroidvania to it. It was just strict using mechanics to get through.
Yeah. I've got a couple here, but since you mentioned Battletoads, I feel we would all be remiss if we didn't mention DuckTales.
Yeah, good one.
That was such an amazing game.
Good one. I was going to throw in Contra, too, because technically it's a platform shooter.
Yeah, there you go.
But anyway.
Maybe Vector Man. But new as far as new ones go, you've got... I wanted to mention Shovel Knight, because that's a great game.
I know you like Shovel Knight, for sure.
Limbo.
Yep.
In its own right is a very good game.
Yep.
And what else I have? We talked about Portal a little bit earlier. Portal... amazing 3D platformer and puzzler. Like that's kind of in the vein of Braid, but on a 3D level.
And an FPS
as well. And an FPS as well, yeah.
Sure.
It crosses over.
You're right. It covers... Portal is the greatest game because it covers all that shit.
And I guess one of the first like modern ones I wanted to also mention is Little Big Planet.
Good call.
Which changed a lot of things for... I know... I was a big fan of the first game. I know probably none of you guys...
I played a bit of
much of it.
Very little.
But... it was just a game that changed kind of the way that physics is used in a platformer.
Sure.
And that's really cool to me.
And hell, we could talk about that too, but like we shouldn't at this point. But it's a good point that it sort of was like it was what was it, a PS3 game, I believe? First Little Big Planet? Something like that.
PS
might have been 2 or 3. Regardless, like it was sort of like the new guard, like the graphics were incredible, but at the core of it, certainly it was still a platformer, and you're right. It was able to use a lot of like messing around with physics and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So what else you got? Got any other ones? Want to throw out? Let's see if I forgot.
What else did I have on this list? The only other one I had on my list of modern games is Super Meat Boy, which is a good indie game.
I had it too. Yep. Really good nice. Good call.
Just a solid indie platform. It didn't change any rules. It didn't break anything. All it did was do it really well in like kind of a retro style, but brought into the new age.
But it was also embraced Nintendo hard.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh yeah.
So it was all of those. Yeah,
so it was retro in that idea, But it was it was a fun game.
No, you're right. I was going to mention that one too if you didn't. But yeah, good call.
Yeah.
So I mean, platformers stand to this day, and for the reasons I think we just laid out, and I don't think they're going to go away anytime soon. In fact, there are a couple that just came out very recently, like a month or two ago, as the time of this recording, late summer. One called Sundered. And I'm sorry, the other name escapes me, but it was basically a straight up platformer, like it's supposed to have amazing artwork.
Yeah.
But all I'm saying, like, as we said, I don't think this genre is going away anytime soon, and I'm excited to see the iterations that come out of it, given that it's has such a long-standing history, and many fans are still like, yeah, give us another platformer, let's see what you got, see what you can do with a platformer.
Absolutely.
Type game. So, I think that'll do it, right, gentlemen?
Yeah, that's it for me.
Well, this has been Syntax Error. I've been Scott Thurlow with Janie Manzer.
Who knew there were so many bottomless pits in the world?
Yep, and Stephen Amosi.
Jumping off on another platform. Good night.
And I will be in a bottomless pit myself on a platform. See you next time.
Editing and engineering by Scott Thurla. Music by Stephen Hermosi. Check us out on YouTube and iTunes for the shows, and on Facebook and Twitter for updates.